When the old veteran walked into the restaurant where I worked, my manager started mocking him. Oh, great. The homeless war guy again. Don't ruin the vibe. I didn't join her, so they fired me. But she didn't know I wasn't going to let it slide. So here's how this whole crazy thing started. I was working at this Greasy Spoon diner in Jacksonville, Florida. You know the type. Sticky floors, coffee that tastes like it was brewed in a gym sock, and the kind of place where dreams go to die. The pay was garbage, but hey, rent doesn't pay itself, right? It was a Tuesday evening, around 7:30, when this older gentleman walked through our front door. First thing I noticed were the military patches on his worn jacket. Couldn't make out all the details from across the room, but you could tell this guy had seen some stuff. He walked with a slight limp, using a wooden cane, but carried himself with this quiet dignity that honestly made me straighten up a bit behind the counter. The guy didn't make a scene or anything, just quietly made his way to table 6, that corner booth by the window that nobody really liked because the vinyl was cracked and the table wobbled. He sat down real careful, like placed his cane against the wall, and just waited patiently for someone to come over. Now, I should mention my manager, Carol. Picture every stereotype of a bitter middle-aged woman who peaked in high school and never got over it. She had this permanent scowl and seemed to take personal offense at anyone who didn't look like they belonged in her version of suburban paradise. The moment this veteran walked in, I could see her face scrunch up like she just smelled something rotten. I grabbed a menu and started heading over to table 6 when Carol practically materialized next to me. She had this way of moving like a vulture swooping down on roadkill. She leaned in close and whispered just loud enough for half the restaurant to hear her toxic commentary about our new customer. The words that came out of her mouth made my stomach turn. She called him the homeless war guy and made it clear she thought he was going to ruin the vibe of our illustrious establishment. Like our diner was some 5-star joint instead of a place where the health inspector probably needed hazard pay. But Carol wasn't done. Oh no. She was just getting warmed up. She marched right over to table 6, planted herself in front of this quiet old man, and basically interrogated him about whether he had money to pay for food. Her tone was so condescending, so disrespectful, that I felt my face getting hot with embarrassment for even being associated with this place. The veteran just looked up at her with these calm, steady eyes and nodded once. Didn't argue, didn't get defensive, didn't cause a scene. Just acknowledged her question with the kind of dignity I wish I had half of on my worst days. That's when something inside me just snapped. Maybe it was growing up hearing my grandfather's stories about World War II, or maybe it was just basic human decency finally winning out over my need for this crappy job. Either way, I found myself walking over to Carol and this veteran, and the words just came tumbling out before I could stop them. I told Carol that this man was a customer just like anyone else. And if she had a problem with that, maybe she should be the one leaving. The entire restaurant went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that sticky linoleum floor. Carol's face went through about 17 different shades of red before settling on a color I can only describe as apoplectic purple. She started sputtering about respect and authority, and who did I think I was talking to? Meanwhile, I'm standing there realizing I just basically told my boss to take a long walk off a short pier in front of a dining room full of witnesses. The veteran looked up at me with something that might have been gratitude, but mostly just seemed tired, like he'd been through this exact scenario more times than anyone should have to endure. That look hit me harder than Carol's inevitable retaliation was about to. Sure enough, Carol found her voice and her power trip all at once. She ordered me to take off my apron right there in front of everyone, said I was fired effective immediately and could find the door myself. The whole restaurant was watching this train wreck unfold, and I could feel my face burning with a mixture of embarrassment and righteous anger. But you know what? As I untied that stupid apron with the restaurant's logo that looked like it was designed by someone's colorblind nephew, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months working at this place, relief. Pure, unadulterated relief. I walked over to table 6, apologized to the veteran for the scene, and told him his meal was on me. He tried to object, but I insisted. It was literally the least I could do after watching him get treated like garbage in what should have been a safe space for anyone looking for a decent meal. As I headed toward the exit, I could hear Carol already spinning the story to the other employees about insubordination and proper workplace hierarchy. But I also caught a few customers giving her some serious side-eye, like maybe they weren't by her version of events. Walking to my beat-up Honda in the parking lot, I realized I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do next. No job, rent due in 6 days, and a bank account that was already on life support. But somehow, standing up to Carol felt more important than keeping that dead-end position in her toxic little kingdom. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching through the window as the veteran quietly ate his meal alone at table 6. Something about the whole situation felt unfinished, like this was just the opening chapter of a much bigger story. Little did I know, I was absolutely right about that, because what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about justice, dignity, and sometimes getting exactly what you deserve. But that night, driving home to my crappy apartment with no job and no prospects, I had no idea that standing up for one old veteran was about to become the best decision I'd ever made in my entire life. So there I was, unemployed in Jacksonville with 6 days until rent was due and about $43 to my name. If you've never experienced the special kind of panic that comes with being broke in America, let me paint you a picture. It's like being on a game show where every wrong answer costs you your apartment. The next morning, I put on my least wrinkled shirt and started what I like to call the unemployment death march. You know how it goes. Walk into every business within a 5-mile radius with a stack of resumes that nobody actually wants to read, wearing your fake interview smile until your face hurts. First stop was the Starbucks down the street. The manager looked like she was maybe 19 and had that particular brand of corporate enthusiasm that makes you want to throw something. She took my resume, glanced at it for about 2 seconds, and gave me the classic line about how they'd call if anything opened up. Translation: your resume is going straight into the trash the moment you walk out that door. The CVS pharmacy was next. Same story, different poorly ventilated retail hellscape. Then the auto parts store, where the guy behind the counter actually laughed when I asked about applications. Apparently, they only hired people with automotive experience, which I definitely didn't have unless you count the time I successfully changed my own oil without flooding my driveway. By day 3 of this soul-crushing routine, I was getting desperate. Applied to work at a car wash where the manager spoke to me like I was applying to be his personal servant. Then there was the warehouse job at some sketchy distribution center that looked like the kind of place where workplace accidents get covered up rather than reported. The FedEx hub seemed promising until they told me the overnight shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m., with mandatory overtime during peak season. At that point, I was seriously considering it just to keep a roof over my head. My living situation wasn't helping my job search confidence either. I was renting this tiny room in a house that had seen better decades. The floor was concrete painted gray, and I'm pretty sure the previous tenant was either a monk who took a vow of comfort poverty or someone who genuinely enjoyed sleeping on what felt like a medieval torture device disguised as a mattress. The bed frame made noises that could wake the dead every time I moved. Even rolling over sounded like someone was slowly torturing a wounded animal in the next room. My neighbors probably thought I was running some kind of weird percussion ensemble in there. Day 4 brought a new low when I applied to work at a gas station that required a personality test. A personality test to sell lottery tickets and energy drinks to people who clearly had their lives more together than I did. The questions were ridiculous. Stuff like whether I thought stealing a paperclip was morally equivalent to robbing a bank. The pizza place interview was even worse. The owner kept interrupting me to answer his phone, and when he finally focused on me for 30 seconds, he asked if I had reliable transportation. When I mentioned my Honda, he made this face like I just told him I planned to deliver pizzas by unicycle. That evening, I was sitting in my concrete floor room calculating how much ramen I could afford when someone knocked on my door. Not the kind of gentle knock you get from friends or family, but that specific uncertain tap that says the person on the other side isn't sure they have the right place. I opened the door, and there was a veteran from the restaurant. Same worn jacket with the military patches, same wooden cane, but something about his expression looked different. Less tired, maybe, more purposeful. He apologized for what happened at the diner, which was absolutely ridiculous because he had nothing to apologize for. I tried to tell him that getting fired was my choice and my consequences, but he held up his hand in this gentle way that made it clear he had something important to say. The old man reached into a paper bag and pulled out a coffee and what looked like a homemade sandwich wrapped in wax paper. My stomach growled, loud enough that I'm pretty sure he heard it from 3 feet away. Pride wanted me to refuse, but hunger and basic human decency won out. We stood there for a minute in that awkward way you do when someone shows you unexpected kindness and you don't know how to process it. He had this way of being quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, like he understood that sometimes silence says more than words ever could. Then he told me to meet him the next day at this old motel on Market Street. Said he wanted to give me something, and that it was important. The way he said it made me think this wasn't just going to be career advice or a pep talk about keeping my chin up during tough times. After he left, I sat there eating that sandwich and trying to figure out what just happened. The coffee was actually good, way better than the swill we served at the diner. The sandwich was turkey and cheese with mustard. Simple, but made with the kind of care that told me this guy had been taking care of people his whole life. Part of me wondered if this was some kind of setup. You hear stories about scams targeting desperate people, and I was definitely fitting that description pretty well at the moment. But something about the way he carried himself, that quiet dignity I'd noticed at the restaurant, made me think this was something else entirely. I spent most of that night staring at the ceiling and listening to my neighbors argue through the thin walls about whose turn it was to buy groceries. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was worried about the same basic survival stuff as people in dysfunctional relationships, just from a different angle. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I had no idea what this veteran wanted to give me, but honestly, at that point, even good advice would have felt like winning the lottery. I just hoped whatever it was would help me figure out my next move before I ended up joining the ranks of people who know way too much about which convenience stores have the cleanest bathrooms and the most sympathetic managers. The next morning, I found myself walking toward Market Street with that weird mixture of curiosity and desperation that comes with having absolutely nothing left to lose. The old motel the veteran mentioned was one of those places that had probably been decent back when people still wore suits to travel, but now looked like the kind of establishment where dreams go to die slowly. I spotted him sitting on a bench outside the motel office, wearing the same jacket with all those military patches. In the daylight, I could make out more details. There were medals and ribbons that looked like they meant something important, the kind of decorations you don't just buy at an army surplus store. He saw me coming and stood up with that careful movement that told me his joints weren't what they used to be. There was something different about his posture today, though more resolute, like he'd made a decision about something significant and was ready to follow through with it. The old man introduced himself as Glenn Royce, and when he mentioned serving with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam, suddenly all those patches and medals made a lot more sense. This wasn't just some random veteran. This guy had been to the kind of experiences that most of us only see in movies. Glenn reached into his jacket and pulled out this small metal box, the kind that looked like it had been designed to survive pretty much anything. It was scratched and dented, but obviously well-maintained, like something you'd keep important documents in if you were the type of person who planned for worst-case scenarios. He handed it to me with both hands, which felt ceremonial somehow, like this wasn't just passing along an object, but transferring something much more significant. The weight of it surprised me, heavier than it looked, with the kind of solid construction they don't seem to make anymore. When I opened the box, I found myself looking at what appeared to be someone's entire military legacy condensed into a few carefully preserved items. There was a silver bracelet with coordinates engraved on it, an old military ID that had seen better decades, and some kind of official document that looked important but was written in the kind of bureaucratic language that makes your eyes glaze over. Glenn must have noticed my confusion because he started explaining, and what he told me next basically turned my understanding of the world upside down. Apparently, back in 1972, during something called Operation Enhance Plus, he'd come into possession of a gold ingot as part of some kind of military confiscation that I didn't fully understand. The document was essentially a storage receipt from Fort Knox, but not the tourist version most people think about. This was for a private storage facility that handled assets for military personnel who didn't trust banks or the government to keep their valuables safe. Apparently, Glenn had stashed this thing away and just never retrieved it. Here's where it gets crazy. The paperwork showed that the storage receipt could be legally transferred to another person with the right documentation and witnesses. Glenn had already filled out most of the transfer forms, and all he needed was my signature to make it official. I'm standing there holding this box, trying to process what he's telling me, and honestly thinking this has to be some kind of elaborate joke. People don't just hand over potentially valuable assets to strangers they met at crappy diners. This kind of thing happens in movies, not to unemployed guys from Jacksonville who can't even afford decent ramen. But Glenn was completely serious. He explained that he'd never use a storage facility because he'd lost faith in institutions after coming back from Vietnam. Too many promises broken, too many veterans forgotten or mistreated by the same government they'd served faithfully. The old man looked at me with these eyes that had obviously seen way too much, and said something that I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. He told me that life gives people rare chances to make a real difference, and that I was the only person in years who bothered to remember that he existed as a human being worth defending. I tried to argue, tried to tell him that what happened at the restaurant was just basic decency, not some heroic act worthy of this kind of generosity. But he shook his head with this quiet certainty that made it clear his mind was made up. Glenn handed me a business card for a law office downtown and told me they'd been expecting my call. Apparently, he'd already set up the legal framework for this transfer, which meant he'd been planning this for a while. This wasn't some impulsive decision based on one encounter at a diner. The whole situation felt surreal, like I'd somehow stumbled into someone else's life story. Here I was, worried about making rent, and this virtual stranger was handing me documents that could potentially change everything. It was a kind of plot twist that makes you question whether you're actually awake or just having a really vivid dream. Before I could fully process what was happening, Glenn was shaking my hand and telling me to take care of myself. He walked back toward the motel with that same dignified pace, leaving me standing there holding a metal box that might contain the solution to every financial problem I'd ever had. I spent the rest of that day reading and rereading the documents, trying to understand the legal language and figure out if this was actually legitimate. The storage facility was real. I could look it up online. The law office was real too, with actual reviews and everything. That night, lying on my torture device of a mattress, I kept thinking about Glenn's expression when he handed me that box. There was something final about it, like he'd been carrying around this responsibility for decades and was finally ready to let it go to someone he trusted. Part of me wondered if I should try to find him again, maybe convince him to keep whatever was in that storage facility for himself. But something told me that would be missing the point entirely. This wasn't just about money or assets. It was about one person recognizing another person's basic humanity and deciding to do something meaningful about it. The next morning, I called the law office that Glenn had mentioned. The receptionist seemed to know exactly who I was before I even finished explaining why I was calling, which confirmed that the old veteran had definitely been planning this transfer for a while. The lawyer, a middle-aged guy named Richardson, who specialized in military asset recovery, took one look at Glenn's documents and whistled low under his breath. Apparently, what I was holding wasn't just legitimate. It was a kind of paperwork that most people never see because the military doesn't exactly advertise these types of storage programs. Richardson explained that during the Vietnam era, certain military operations resulted in asset confiscations that soldiers were allowed to claim as personal property under specific circumstances. The government would hold these assets in secure storage, and soldiers could retrieve them after their service ended. But a lot of veterans never followed through for various reasons. According to the documentation, Glenn's ingot was part of a seizure during Operation Enhance Plus in 1972. The military had essentially told him he could claim it after 20 years, but when that time came, he'd chosen not to retrieve it. The storage facility had been holding it ever since, accruing fees that the government continued to pay. Here's where things got interesting. Richardson pulled up the current records for Glenn's storage unit, and what he found made both of us do a double take. We weren't talking about some small commemorative piece or a token amount of precious metal. This was a legitimate gold ingot weighing 400 troy ounces. I had to ask him to repeat that number because it didn't seem real. 400 troy ounces of gold, sitting in a government storage facility for over 50 years, legally belonging to a veteran who decided to transfer ownership to some random guy he'd met at a diner. Richardson did some quick calculations on a computer, factoring in current gold prices, and the number he showed me made my knees go weak. At current market rates, we were looking at something in the neighborhood of $900,000, maybe more, depending on the purity and exact market conditions when it got sold. I immediately felt like I was going to throw up, not from excitement, but from the overwhelming realization that this level of generosity was way beyond anything I could ever repay. How do you thank someone for literally changing your entire life trajectory with one metal box and some paperwork? My first instinct was to find Glenn and try to give everything back. This felt too big, too life-changing to accept from someone I barely knew. Richardson must have seen this reaction before, because he calmly explained that the transfer was already legally binding once I'd signed the documents. More importantly, he told me something that Glenn had apparently insisted on including in the legal paperwork. If I tried to return the asset or refused to claim it, the ownership would revert to the government, not back to Glenn. The old veteran had specifically structured it this way to prevent me from giving it back out of misplaced guilt. I spent the next 2 days in a weird state of denial, like this was all going to turn out to be some elaborate prank or mistake. I kept expecting someone to call and tell me there had been a clerical error, or that Glenn wasn't actually authorized to transfer ownership, or that the whole thing was somehow illegal. But every time Richardson's office ran another verification check, everything came back legitimate. The storage facility confirmed the asset was there. The military records matched Glenn's service history. The transfer documents were properly notarized and filed with all the right agencies. I decided I needed to see Glenn one more time before I could move forward with claiming the ingot. Something about accepting this gift without at least trying to thank him properly felt wrong. So I went back to motel on Market Street, ready to have what I figured would be the most important conversation of my life. The desk clerk told me that Glenn had checked out 2 days earlier, the same day he'd given me the metal box. No forwarding address, no indication of where he was going next. Just paid his bill and left with the same quiet efficiency he'd probably used his entire life. I asked around the neighborhood, thinking maybe someone had seen where he went or knew how to contact him. The convenience store clerk remembered him buying coffee every morning, but said he'd always paid cash and never mentioned anything about his plans. The bus station attendant thought maybe she'd seen him board a Greyhound heading north, but couldn't be sure. It was like Glenn Royce had simply dissolved back into the anonymous flow of American life, leaving behind only the metal box and the legal documents that proved our encounter had actually happened. Part of me wondered if that had been his plan all along, to disappear before I could try to talk him out of his generous decision. That evening, I found a note slipped under my door that I somehow hadn't noticed earlier. It was written in the careful handwriting of someone who'd grown up before computers, and the message was short but powerful enough to stick with me forever. Glenn had written that life gives people rare chances to make a real difference, and that I was the only person in recent memory who'd bothered to treat him like a human being deserving of basic respect. He said he hoped I'd use this opportunity to do something meaningful, both for myself and for others who might need the kind of help he was giving me. The note ended with a simple request, that I not spend time feeling guilty about accepting his gift, but instead focus on making sure it actually improved the world in some small way. He signed it with his full name and military service details, like he was filing an official report that he wanted preserved for posterity. Sitting there reading those words over and over, I realized that trying to find Glenn to return his gift would actually be disrespecting his wishes. He clearly thought this through carefully and wanted me to move forward, not get stuck in an endless cycle of gratitude and guilt. The question now was whether I had the courage to actually claim what he'd given me and figure out how to honor his request. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to actually go to the storage facility and claim Glenn's gift. 3 weeks of staring at that metal box, reading his note over and over, and try to convince myself that I deserved this incredible stroke of luck that had fallen into my lap. The facility itself was exactly what you'd expect from a government-adjacent operation that had been running since the 1970s. All concrete and fluorescent lights, and the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that makes you feel like a very small cog in a very large machine. The attendant who helped me retrieve the ingot treated the whole thing like it was just another Tuesday morning transaction. He wheeled out this heavy cart with a sealed container that required 3 different keys and 2 separate verification codes to open. When he finally lifted the lid, there was 400 troy ounces of gold in a single bar, stamped with official government markings and dates that confirmed everything Richardson had told me. The weight of it was incredible, not just physically but emotionally. This chunk of metal represented more money than my family had ever seen at one time, more financial security than I'd ever imagined having, and more responsibility than I'd ever asked for. Richardson had connected me with a licensed precious metals dealer in New York who specialized in this type of government-issued gold. The authentication process took 2 days and involved more paperwork than buying a house. But when it was finished, I had a certified check for $912,000 sitting in my bank account. For about a week, I just stared at my online banking screen like it was showing someone else's information. The numbers looked fake, like a glitch in the system that would eventually get corrected by some computer algorithm that would realize I wasn't supposed to be rich. But Glenn's note kept echoing in my head about using this opportunity to do something meaningful. So I started by setting aside $100,000 for the Wounded Warrior Project, figuring that helping other veterans was probably what he would have wanted most. The rest of the money sat in my account while I tried to figure out how to honor the spirit of Glenn's gift without just blowing it all on the kind of stupid purchases that lottery winners always regret. I wanted to do something that would make a real difference, something that would justify the faith this old veteran had placed in me. That's when I found out that the diner where I'd gotten fired was up for sale. Apparently, Carol's management style had finally caught up with her in the form of a wave of terrible online reviews and complaints to corporate. The parent company had decided to cut their losses and liquidate the location rather than deal with the ongoing reputation damage. I spent a few days researching the asking price and the restaurant financials, trying to figure out if buying it would be a smart business decision or just an expensive form of revenge. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like exactly the kind of meaningful action Glenn had been talking about. I made an offer through a lawyer, using a shell company name, so Carol wouldn't know who was buying her former workplace. The negotiations took about 2 weeks, but eventually we had a deal. I was now the proud owner of the same Greasy Spoon Diner, where I'd been fired for defending an old veteran's dignity. The first thing I did was schedule a staff meeting for a Monday morning, when I knew Carol would be there handling the transition paperwork. I showed up in my best suit, carrying the ownership documents, and feeling like I was about to deliver the most satisfying speech in my entire life. When I walked into that dining room where Glenn had been humiliated and I'd been fired for standing up to it, Carol was sitting at table 6, the same booth where the whole thing had started. The irony was so perfect it felt like the universe had a sense of humor about justice. I introduced myself as the new owner and watched Carol's face go through several different expressions as she tried to process what was happening. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally a kind of resigned panic as she realized her world was about to change dramatically. The conversation was short and professional. I explained that there would be new management policies focused on treating all customers with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance, financial status, or background. I mentioned that employees who couldn't adapt to this new culture would need to find opportunities elsewhere. Carol tried to argue, tried to claim that she'd been following company policy and protecting the restaurant's image. But we both knew what had really happened at Table 6, and we both knew that her version of customer service had no place in the kind of establishment I wanted to run. I gave her 2-week severance pay and a recommendation letter that focused on her organizational skills rather than her people management approach. It wasn't cruel, but it was final. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the right values get reinforced and the wrong ones get consequences. After Carol left, I spent the rest of that day walking around the restaurant and thinking about Glenn. He'd given me more than just financial security. He'd given me the power to make sure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to other veterans, or really to anyone who deserved basic human dignity. I kept most of the existing staff, but brought in a new manager who understood that our job was to serve food and treat people well, not to judge customers based on appearances or economic status. We put up a small plaque by the front door dedicating the restaurant to all veterans who'd served their country with honor. The funny thing is, the business actually improved under the new management approach. Turns out that when you treat customers like human beings worth respecting, they tend to come back more often and recommend you to their friends. Who would have thought that basic decency could be good for business? I never saw Glenn Royce again, but I think he would have been proud of what we built with his incredible gift. The restaurant became the kind of place where everyone was welcome, where veterans could eat in peace, and where employees knew they'd be supported for doing the right thing. Sometimes late at night, when I'm closing up and turning off the lights, I look over at table 6 and remember that Tuesday evening when an old veteran's quiet dignity and unexpected generosity changed everything. Glenn taught me that real strength isn't about having power over other people. It's about using whatever power you have to make sure everyone gets treated with the respect they deserve.